traveling. My name is Michael Lardner, but a lot of people here know me. I'm part of the Marxist Education Project that began the day after the Brecht Forum was closed here in New York. We have been putting programs together all over, and Marcello Musto graciously spoke with us on his wonderful book, The Last Years of Karl Marx, in December. And between my asking him to speak and his actual speaking, he made me aware of this really dynamic series called Marx-Engels-Marxisms that is being done by Palgrave Macmillan. And a co-editor with Marcello is with us today, Terrell Carver. Along with Terrell is Kaan Kangal, who is here at 5 a.m. So whatever trouble anyone here has had, Kaan is here at 5 in the morning, ready to speak to us on Engels.
Wow, thank you.
To start us off today, I wanted to introduce Mary Boger, who is a founder of our project going back to the mid-70s. We are now 46 years as a Center for Marxist Education with different names, different formations, but we continue with the same essential principles as when the school began. I call it the school because it was initially the School for Marxist Education. So I am turning the floor to Mary Boger, and she is going to talk a little bit, just a few minutes, on the importance of Engels to our Marxist Education project. And then we will, from there, Mary will hand the floor over to Terrell and Kaan, who will talk about their two books, along with the book that Kohei Saito has written. Kohei, unfortunately, was unable to join us today. I will encourage him to come again in the fall or winter of coming up. But enough of me. Mary, if you want to say a few words about our relationship with Engels, that would be great.
Oh, okay. I'm hesitant to spend any time saying anything and let everybody get going. I'll try to even make my 5 or 6 minute thing shorter. But I just wanted, so I'll begin by saying that we have these 3 wonderful scholars here from UK, China, and Japan. And it clearly demonstrates that the international importance of recognizing Engels today. So that's just a thing I want to take note of. Interestingly, in 1975, when we formed the first school, was a period when there were political and scholastic tendencies. I'm having to look at my thing because I want to just take a couple of things and make it shorter. Tendencies that sought to break the connection between the natural world, natural history, from human development and social history by separating the dialectical historical materialist methodologies applicability to nature, even ignoring the fact that Marx and Engels had written early on in their meeting with each other the German ideology and the premises of history, which are based on that. In our own experience doing the school for Marxist education, in 1979, the late Arthur Fellerbaum, who was the one who conceptualized doing Marxist education in the U.S., for movement building, conceptualized, took on this question and wrote, politically critiqued the attempt to debunk Engels and wrote a discussion piece entitled In Defense of Engels. So having today's talk in particular has a lot of meaning to us, especially those of us going back to the early days. But as a preamble to today's discussion, I just wanted to bring out 2 salient comments that Engels made in Dialectics of Nature, which I think are relevant for today's talk. One, Engels put forward that whether or not natural scientists would consciously apply a dialectical methodology, in practice, they would do so simply because, to the extent they were seriously engaged in understanding the developmental processes within natural history, they would, as scientists, have to adopt such a methodological approach. That such is evident is seen across all the sciences, especially since the rise of the understanding of the ecological conditions and processes of speciation and development and our place within that. The second comment in part explains the first. Engels understood that all that comes into being perishes. It is the nature of reality, of existence. Our sun is but a star and is slowly dying. The solar system we take for granted is slowly changing. A unity of opposites, internal contradictions, and developmental transformations are at work. And time in our universe only moves forward. Even physics, the last bastion of ahistorical absolutism, which has been premised on uncovering the universal absolute laws of the universe as set and unchanging, are having to rethink their premises and have turned to what were considered the lesser historical sciences like biology to reconfigure their notions and methodology. Marxist, in our experience, we've had numerous Marxist natural scientists, Richard Levin, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, speakers the MEP has had in our Socialist Register series, like Larry Lohman, and there's just many, many others, who across all fields of study of our natural world and social world are now applying what we call Marxist science to their particular study. And they are tying the specific to the interwoven general development processes of existence. Lastly, I just want to say, like Engels, evolutionary biologists know all species that come into being will also go extinct. But at this late stage of moribund, globalized capitalist development, they also know that what has taken millenniums, a species extinction, is now occurring within decades. Of mammals today, 60% are livestock, 36% humans, and 4% wildlife. Both Engels and Marx understood that by reproducing ourselves according to the dictates of capitalist accumulation, solely premised on money making more money, through the private ownership and commodification of all that exists, including our individual and species capacities, was rapidly bringing humanity and our natural conditions to an end game. Our production is not premised on the usefulness of the products we make to the continuation of all life, but the profits that will be realized through their sale. Throughout the writings of Marx and Engels, they each address ecological concerns, which are seen as integral to why the working class and their allies have the responsibility to begin the process of reclaiming our specific species capacities, most particularly purposeful activity. We must imagine before we act, as part of natural history, and bring an end to all forms of class exploitation and oppression. And I just want to end with this, with what as Marx put it, we are the species that can know ourselves as products of natural history. Therefore, we are the species responsible to all of nature. He said that. This is 100 and some years ago. They already knew this. This is our historical challenge today. What needs to be done to begin the transition that reconstitutes our dialectical relationship with nature, what Marx once expressed as the coming together of the naturalization of man and the humanization of nature. Today's discussion and the works of our participants are part of this necessary reclamation. I can't stress that enough. We are so fortunate, so that we can become together as a unified, historically conscious social agent for change. And I'm delighted to now not take any more our time, so we can hear these wonderful guests that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Now we will hear from Terrell Carver, who will talk. I'm not looking at the title of your book. And because we don't have yours or Kaan's books, it's hard to just refer to them. So I will count on both of you to talk about your books, their meaning, etc. Everyone, please welcome Terrell Carver to the MEP. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. I'm delighted and honoured to be with you in this worldwide link-up. And thanks very much to Mary for the very inspiring introduction, because I think that gives us a very good start on the discussion today. So we've had a bit of consultation here, and I'll say a few words about the book series that I started with Marcello Musto just about 10 years ago. And then I'll hand over to Kaan Kangal, who's with us from Nanjing, and ask him to talk about his work on Engels and the Dialectics of Nature. And then, with the chair's permission, he can hand back to me, and I will talk about my latest book in the series, which is called Engels Before Marx. And then, as per our consultation, and since Kohei very unfortunately can't be with us from Japan, Kaan and I will each give a personal appreciation of his book Ecological Socialism, which is actually not in the series, but as a sort of sneak preview, his edited collection on Engels is just coming out, so we can advertise that a bit as well. So, what's the story on the book series? As Michael said, it's with Palgrave Macmillan in the New York City office. There are two things to say that about how and why it's distinctive. It's Marx, Engels, and Marxisms. So the idea is to mention each of those three things individually so that people can talk about, write about, or discuss any particular one, or indeed all three together, very much as people choose, but one isn't required to take any combination of those in any particular ideological formation or with any particular commitment to some conceptual point of view. So the titling is distinctive, I think, not least because it's got Engels in there by name and not just Marx and Marxism. So I did quite a lot of fighting on that one, and I'm really pleased because it was said we never have any books on Engels, and of course that's really not true. And I think at that point we hadn't quite realized or thought ahead to the bicentenary last year, which has been a terrific year, kicking off in Wuppertal, Engels' hometown, with an actual physical conference, which was the last one that I went to, and everything else has been online, including quite a number of events, which Kaan will know, in the People's Republic of China and indeed elsewhere in the world. So the other thing that's distinctive about this series is that from the very beginning, Marcello and I wanted to get more voices from more different places in more different languages actually into the Anglophone conversation. So besides getting great books on Marx, Engels, and Marxisms, we also wanted to get works in translation from all over the world. As anyone who works with Anglophone publishers and book series will know, it's quite difficult to get publishers to get into negotiating the rights, really carry this off, and to deal with translation. So we limped along for a few years, and then magically an editor appeared at Palgrave Macmillan who looked me in the eye and said, "I really like negotiating foreign rights." And I nearly fell over. I'd never heard anyone in publishing say that to me before, and I could not believe our luck. She's since departed Palgrave, which is not unusual in the publishing world, but the successors have carried that on very well. So we definitely need a lot of help negotiating these. And there's only been one exception out of, I should think, 20-25 projects where the rights ultimately failed. And all those other cases, the rights have gone through, and it takes quite a lot of work. So the series has expanded rapidly, and this is very much due to Marcello, who's in command of 5 languages at least with perfect fluency: English, Italian, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and he can probably bang along in French, I should think, with not much trouble. So that possibly makes 6. Anyway, he's the one who has been beating the bushes around the world and getting people on board. So we've had quite a few works come out in translation, and there are a lot more. There are also original works coming out in the native language and in English in the book series. So it's a paragon of international series, I think. And that's the story on that one. So I'll hand over to Kaan now. We met in Nanjing at a Marx conference, and I really wanted to have his book in the series, not least because the textual scholarship is so meticulous, so thorough, so admirable, and so informative. So I'll hand over to Kaan to introduce his book by title and say a few words about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. Now, a few words on how I came to this project. I think it started with an article draft I have sent to Terrell a few years back, probably 1 or 2 years before I published this book. This is this piece I published in Science and Society, I believe it is, in 2019. So you can understand the book like a long statement, actually an extended version of this article I published. Now, this is quite a short book, actually, although it is over 200 pages, but given the content and the complexity of the arguments, the issues that I tackle in this book, you can say that this is rather a short book, but a long statement. Now, I could do this in a fashion of a lecture or like a book introduction. I really didn't make my mind about this, but if I have to summarize, the main argument is, I could say that the old debate on Angus is clustered around the so-called Angus problem, namely the old question whether Marx agreed with Engels' Dialectics of Nature, and the question is whether dialectics applies to nature or not. So on the one side, I always thought that this is an interesting problem, but on the other side, I thought the opposite, that this is actually a boring problem because it is counterproductive. And for me, there was no such issue as to whether dialectics applies to nature, and probably the reason is I had a certain way of looking at dialectics, and that was pretty unproblematic, regardless of how it was conceptualized in different traditions. So before this book was written and before this project was undertaken, I read quite a lot on the background of this issue. I went back to the German tradition, and I do have a Germanic background in terms of my education. I delved into the Germanic debates, into Russian-Soviet debates, and so on. So on the one side, I could say that there is a history that concerns the interpretation of dialectics in general and the dialectics of nature, of Engels in particular. And on the other side, there is a history that concerns the text that we call dialectics of nature. So I try to bridge the divide between the text and interpretation, and this is pretty much the properly standard way of dealing with a subject matter as Engels' Dialectics of Nature. So you could say that this book it tries to outline the historical development of these two dimensions of text and interpretation of dialectics of nature. Now, I already gave the keywords for the interpretation. The text itself is indeed a complexity, and it is under-researched. That is, it is pretty hard to find documents of the history of Engels' text. And I divide this into two parts. One is the history of writing of Dialectics of Nature, and the other one is the editorial history. So these are all pretty interesting, and I thought it is pretty self-evident that if you want to develop a certain understanding of Engels' motives and goals, ultimate aims, and so on, then you have to distinguish the different development phases of Engels' writing. And it turns out that actually this is not how Engels has been read. What we have is usually that as if we have a finished, complete book, and one school of interpretation goes rather anti-Engels, and the other one is hardcore Leninist, kind of pro-Engels. And there's this very strong division, pro and anti-Engels camps that really dominated, obviously, the last century. Now, what I try to do is go a little beyond this simple binary that is being pro or anti-Engels, and try to make a more productive, more creative reading of Engels. And what this brought me to is that what we have in Engels' Dialectics of Nature is less a minefield in terms of the ideological oppositions and confrontations, but a pool or a source of contradictions that really call for a deeper investigation of Engels' concerns. So this is the side that makes up the connection between text and interpretation. So what we have is this in terms of the textual history. What we know as Dialectics of Nature is a title that has been invented after Engels died. This is a posthumous title, and Engels' Dialectics of Nature has been published for the first time in Soviet Union, as many other texts that have been discovered in 20th century under the directorship of David Ryazanov, the head of the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. And the Ryazanov's man, the assistant in Europe, who made the discovery of the manuscripts of Dialectics of Nature, was Boris Nikolaevsky, and he discovered these manuscripts in Eduard Bernstein's archives. And until Dialectics of Nature was called Dialectics of Nature, it has been called other things, such as Engels' Nature Dialectical Work, or Dialectics and Nature, as it has been published in the second edition, or it was called Nature Dialectics, as in the first edition. And close in the 1930s, the editors decided to call it Dialectics of Nature. And it is not just the title that was subject to a textual evolution, also the content of what came to be known as Dialectics of Nature was subject to transformation. So what we have in the German Mega 2 edition, or in the English edition of Marx and Engels, was not identical with what was known as Dialectics of Nature in the first, second, and third editions. And the funny thing is, one interesting thing about this textual history is that textual history and the content of these editions reflect really the concerns of the editors that pursue a certain ideological and political goal. And that also reflects the kind of image of Engels that they are keen to reflect and show in the eyes of the readers. And that is pretty much the way you shape a certain readership and design the presentation, the form of presentation of the text. And this is one reason why we should also take seriously this evolution of the editorial history of Engels' text. Okay, so this is the thing that concerns the editorial history. And probably I should say a couple of things on the interpretation, and that is what is known as the Engels debate, and what was before that, and what I am saying. in terms of something new. So this Engels debate is, as I said, the classical debate, or the kind of debate that is well known in the Anglophone world, and to which Terrell also actively contributed. And this is also something that I locate in my discussion in the book. As I said, the so-called problem, whether dialectics applies to nature or not, and whether Marx agreed with this idea. So this debate goes back to Georg Lukács' famous book. In fact, that goes back to a famous footnote that Lukács made in passing in his well-known History and Class Consciousness, where he says something like, Engels followed Hegel's mistaken lead by extending dialectics, or the dialectical method, from society to nature, and this was then immediately taken up by the contemporaries of Lukács in Soviet Union and in Germany. In Germany, it was a group of sociologists that were not Marxists, but they were they were closely following this the application of the Marxist term dialectics. And in Soviet Union, this was perceived as an open attack against the Marxist heritage of dialectical philosophy. Now, most of the people, most of the readers of Marx and Engels believe, or most of the followers of these debates concerning Marxist dialectics believe that this is the invention of Lukács, that this claim originally belonged to Lukács, the claim that there's something wrong with Engels' application of dialectics to nature. But as I have tried to trace out the origins of this debate, this goes back to Hegel and Hegel's contemporaries, especially Hegel's students, such as Trendelenburg or Eduard von Hartmann, that already taken up this issue of this application of dialectics to reality. So in 19th century, the problem was not specifically nature and the application of dialectics to nature, but dialectics as it was posited by Hegel and its problematic application to reality in general. Because the classical problem clustered around the issue that the so-called dialectics is a logical operation, and the order of things does not necessarily follow the order of the logical thinking. And this criticism was already spoken out in 19th century by the pupils of Hegel. And this had a certain impact upon the socialist tradition, especially in Eugen von Düring, and after that, Kautsky and Bernstein. And indeed, Lukács just narrowed down this criticism from reality to nature. And after that, it became a hugely political thing that was then utilized to make the ideological distinctions clear between the so-called Western Marxism and the so-called Soviet Marxism. Now, I believe that this debate that occupies pretty much the entire space of the Anglophone debates, and Anglophone debates are just the tiny section, tiny part and parcel of the entire English debate, because there's another kind of discussion in the Soviet Union, and another one similar to Soviet Union is the East German debates, West German debates, French debates, and so on and so forth. So what is known as English debate is this debate, namely the application problem. So I believe that this is, on one side, interesting. That it is interesting to see how a philosophical question can be utilized to this extent and used for demarcate the ideological divisions between different groups or between different political tendencies. And on the other side, it is unfortunate, I believe, because as a latecomer born into this kind of ideological division. I found it pretty, let me say, boring, because it is counterproductive. So on the one side, there are the documents that reveal clearly a cooperation with Marx and Engels, and Terrell would disagree that Marx actively supports and is well informed by Engels' undertaking. And there's one bold claim I am asserted in my book, and that is that had Marx disagreed with Engels, he would have been wrong in terms of the question whether dialectics applies to nature or not. That would have been counter his own intentions and philosophical understanding. So this is one bold thing I have asserted in the book, but this is not really the kind of issue that is my concern. My concern is the productive contradictions, philosophical contradictions, the kind of questions that have been formulated but remain unanswered. This is the interesting thing for me. That is, I am looking at Engels from, as anyone else, from the perspective of the present problems, especially philosophically specific problems. And from that angle, I am looking for answers in Engels' text. And the result is obviously not very positive, but the thing is that the kind of questions I am asking, understandably, are not necessarily there in Engels. So one question that is really at the center of Engels' account is this classical division, the division between metaphysics and dialectics, and relatedly there is another division, and that is idealism and materialism. So if you look at the textbooks or in textbook-like books, understand articles and so on, you would see that these are the kind of classical oppositions. Marxism is identified with materialism and dialectics, whereby metaphysics and idealism are condemned to death. So the kind of reading I have performed is checking Engels' sources and reconsidering his critical relationship with the past philosophical legacies. And the controversial conclusion I came to is that dialectics and metaphysics on one side and materialism and idealism on the other side are actually much closer than Marx and Engels have asserted. Now, if there will be any questions in that regard, I can also deepen that. Now, I'm not entirely sure about our audience today, that is the philosophical background and so on. This is really, if I go into this, there is really no end in the philosophical debates, but I am also capable of explaining further why I think that these oppositions are actually now irreconcilable opposites. Let me finish at least my talk so far with an example in order to make my point rather clear. That is why I think this kind of opposition, for instance, between dialectics and metaphysics, is also of political interest. And this is something I have written in the book. You can check it on your own. So there is this Soviet fellow philosopher. I understand him as the founder of Soviet Marxist philosophy. His name is Deborah. This fellow was a Hegelian and active figure, also a harsh critic of Lukács' attacks against Engels, Lukács' criticism of Engels' dialectics. And Deborah made a name for himself as the initiator of the appropriation of Engels' dialectics from the angle of Marxist philosophy. So he was indeed the shining star or the rising star in 1920s, and his career ends in the beginning of 1930 for his very undertaking of taking Engels seriously. And his so-called mistake, as it was understood and accused of, because of which he was accused of, was this claim: when we speak of dialectics, we speak of opposites and contradictions, and there are two sides of a contradiction, and these two sides are irreconcilable. That is, they are not compatible with one another. So one example that was also taken as the example in this debate, and this is really around the time when Engels' Dialectics of Nature was published for the first time, and it went through the second and third edition between 1925 and 1930. The irreconcilable opposites, so for example, the bourgeois class and the proletarian class or the working class are examples for the irreconcilable opposites, because they have antagonistic interests. Now, Deborah was patient enough to read the whole bunch of Engels' Dialectics of Nature when it was first published, and he quickly saw that the central argument in Engels' Dialectics of Nature was quite the opposite. That the whole point of Dialectics of Nature, the whole point of dialectics in Engels' Dialectics of Nature was to reconcile opposites. So for this, there's a concise and clear example in Engels: the relationship between identity and difference. Engels is saying that if we develop a dialectical conception of transformation and change in nature, then we need a proper combination of a couple of terms, a couple of concepts. And the first candidates are naturally the identity and difference. Engels argued that the kind of concept of change requires to appropriate these two opposite concepts within itself. So Deborah defended this definition of dialectics as the sole definition of dialectics, and he was charged for misrepresenting dialectics for the reason that I have just mentioned, namely this problem concerning the reconcilability or irreconcilability of opposites. So this pretty much gives a clear idea about how a philosophical conception or a philosophical argument can be taken in very different directions and identify with very different ideological orientations. So.
Okay, I can pick up the thread there. The thread is, quote, taking Engels seriously, unquote. But this is very much the other way around, and possibly a bit inside out. So the book that I published last year, Engels Before Marx, and this was the bicentenary book, is, I'm sure, the only book about Engels in which Marx does not exist, and in which he's banned from the text, except in the title. So this is really getting at quite a different reading of what we've got in the archive. And we have quite a big archive on 10 years of Engels' life, from the time he's 15 to just when he's turning 24, 25. So there's a great deal of material, and people have looked at it. But they've generally tried to get through it as quickly as possible, so we can, so that he can get on with his life in the biography and become the guy with whom Marx teams up, and become the guy who wants to team up with Marx. So intellectual biography is a very teleological exercise. We already know who's important, why they're important, and what we want is the story of how what we already know got to be that. So the archive in those conventional studies is already sifted very much from that point of view. So if we take this 10-year archive, that's one way to do it. That is, one goes through and collects up the instances where Engels is starting to look like Marx, or starting to look like the kind of guy who wants to team up with Marx, and the kind of guy whom Marx will like. Part of that exercise is, of course, to sift the archive very, very thoroughly, and actually to dismiss most of it as juvenilia. So quite a bit of it is never mentioned in this rush to get to the teleological goal. Is dismissed as juvenilia or cliched or kind of hackneyed stuff that we already know about. But the problem with that is we already know about this stuff long, long afterwards, when it has already become a cliche. So what I undertook to do was to try to enter the world of the young Engels and get behind his eyes, as it were, to see the world as he saw it, as closely as we can do through the archive. And I wanted to do that because I think it's really very exciting. He was not just an exciting guy, but it was a very exciting world, and we have so much material, and it's so well crafted by him that it's great fun to read and gives us a real sense of the political excitement of the time. And the more we get into that, the more detail we get about what it was actually like to be a radical, free-thinking, liberalizing political thinker and agent, and to try to get published. So we quickly enter the world of repressive authoritarianism and the patchwork of principalities, monarchies, kingdoms, etc., that's stretched from Engels's hometown, very near the Rhine and Düsseldorf, all the way to through the German states and statelets and the odd free city, which was not very free, all the way through the patchwork Austrian Empire, right up to the Russian border. So we're looking at quite a large area that's completely in the grip of repressive authoritarianism, divine right, monarchy, claims to be that way, a complete imbrication of church and state, whatever church it was, and very heavy censorship. So we're into the world where the editors of liberalizing publications are having to shift their periodicals around, live in exile, go abroad, outwit the censor, which is sometimes not all that difficult because they weren't very smart. And a great deal of the liberalizing politics proceeds in code. It looks to us like literature or philosophy, or poetry or painting or commentary on painting or music. And this is often put down just to revolutionary romanticism, that's all over and done with. But at the time, it wasn't over and done with. At the time, it was actually treasonous because liberalization in those terms was about popular sovereignty and constitutionalism. In these areas that I've mentioned, there really aren't any constitutions worth the name. Nobody votes for anything. There's not supposed to be public life or public opinion other than going to church and being very polite in a very religiously strict and repressive society. And that, of course, is exactly the atmosphere Engels grew up in, a particularly extreme version of that. But it wasn't particularly liberal or welcoming to views of a liberal character, even an economically liberal character. These people were in a neo-medieval setup that postdated the brief moments of Napoleonic liberation, such as it was. So this all seems dim and distant history to us, and it's a rather obscure period, the 1820s coming into the 1830s. But I'll just kind of close this little picture by saying that the French Revolution, as we know, is the origin of this liberalization and constitutionalism, which of course, the first example was in the United States. But it wasn't that revolution that was terrorizing everybody. It was the French Revolution of 1830, which changed one monarchy for another. But the popular action involved was terrorism from the point of view of the rulers of all of these regimes. They wanted to repress any ideas, never mind actions or publications, that started getting people to think in that kind of way. So just to be in favor of constitutionalism and the extension of something like a suffrage into something like a representative body for at least some men, certainly not women from this point of view, that was way outside anybody's notion. Not that some women hadn't tried to raise it, but it was so far over the edge is not even really to be thought about. This was actually treasonous, and you got spied on, you lost your job, you got chased out of the country. These places controlled the universities. I mean, they were thought controllers. There's some comments in the biographical literature about how, oh, well, it wasn't really quite that bad because they didn't actually have gulags and that kind of thing. And I think that's certainly true. But from the point of the people who were living through that, that's not how they experienced it. So I tried to capture some of the danger and edginess and excitement of being in this period as Engels lived it. So things that may look like romantic dilettantism are actually politics in code. And he was a very convinced, troublemaking liberalizer in his own way and on his own scale. From the age of 16 and 17 up till just 18, he published anonymously, as most of these publications were, the letters from Wuppertal, which got quite a lot of notice across the German-speaking lands. I have a bit of a problem with using the word Germany before 1871, so I'm on a kind of campaign about that. So in and around the German lands, this did get quite a lot of notice because he was describing the conditions that he'd actually grown up in his hometown, which was one of the very few industrializing areas in that part of the world. The only others were mining districts, really. There wasn't that much manufacture or indeed much friendliness on the part of these regimes to manufacture and to liberalizing in a unifying way the various highly disparate neo-medieval states and statelets which were in control of the ruling families and dynasties of the time. So what happens in that work was that Engels wrote about the conditions of the workers in the factories where he'd grown up, because he was third generation in a spinning, weaving, water-powered industry. And so he wrote very vigorously, not just about the pollution of the river and the horrendous working conditions, which were right on his doorstep. The family compound was right in the middle of the factories and dye works that they owned and had business interests in. So you can actually go and visit that at the moment. Of course, it's all cleaned up, and the river is no longer running turkey red from the dye that they used. So this was quite a scandalous work, and it's pretty well unique, really. Nobody's come up with anything like it. You couldn't really be that interested in the social question of industrial modernization in these states and statelets because there wasn't much to be interested in. So this was a very notable work, and it was, I mean, he published dozens of items, which, again, whether they were travel writing or literary criticism, or satirical, they're parodic, they reflect the politics of liberalization going on in code. So what's the significance of this? Well, I think you get a sense not just of him as a person, but a sense of the milieu, which is all around in that part of the world. And actually, if you go west of the Rhine, all the way over to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, as it was, the situation is not that much different. You don't really have representative and responsible governments. You have court politics pursued by monarchs who put up with the annoyance of having to grant some kind of consultative role to some few people who are elected to assemblies, and they're just as dedicated to keeping out the constitutional liberalism that got started in 1789, 1791, and 1793. So when the young Engels actually gets to Manchester, again working for his father's firm, the only thing that's really different is that there are mass public meetings. Of course, they're spied on by the police and broken up, and there's heavy censorship, but it's rather easier to invade it, to have meetings, and he found that really, really exhilarating. So this is bringing up close to the position that we will know already. And the famous first meeting with Marx, which does not go well, and the second one, supposedly in Paris, which does go well. Just to point out what we're dealing with again here in biography is 40 years of hindsight. So we get told this iconic story of the great meeting in Paris at the Café de la Régence. Well, that may all have been true. And we get told of the cold meeting a couple of years before in Cologne. But actually, young Friedrich went to Cologne twice that year. We don't hear exactly anything much about the first meeting, but this gets back to the context, which is that when Engels turns up at the offices of the Rheinische Zeitung, Marx is actually, a guy in the room, probably at the back. The first meeting, he hasn't really become editor. Engels doesn't talk about that 40 years later because everyone else has disappeared off the map and is no longer important. So we get an odd kind of focus. If you go back experientially, Marx was probably a guy in the back of the room and Engels was hanging out with Moses Hess. Marx became editor, actually, rather accidentally, and we don't hear too much more about that meeting. So I conclude this kind of story really when Engels finally leaves home after he's actually written up the condition of the working class in England, which is, of course, to tell the German audience how horrible its future is going to be unless they do something about capitalism, which is going to come and get them. And it would be much better if they could get some control over it themselves. So I conclude the story when Engels departs home definitively and turns up in Brussels to join the communist collective of Ruger, Hess, and Marx, bearing in mind that the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, contrary to Anglophone editions, was actually edited by Ruger and Marx. So This is a kind of extreme contextualism, if you like. It's been put down that way. I'm not saying you have to read everything in this manner. Those who want the traditional, quite teleological reading are fully entitled to that way of looking at it. But I think if we take young Engels seriously and his milieu seriously, we'll see that this is also the milieu that Marx lived in himself. So we might begin to see his early life and career in somewhat different terms, given that we know an awful lot about this era because Engels was such an accomplished thinker, journalist, commentator, traveler. Marx had never been anywhere at this time. Engels was a very gifted linguist, so we get a much broader picture of the whole milieu that was part of Marx's milieu. It's just Marx had only university experience to go on, and indeed some of his early readers on that newspaper complained that his work was really too philosophical and too hard to read and too hard to grasp. So in doing the book, it's a short book, I chose to approach this thematically, whilst keeping a kind of chronology on board. If we're going to take someone from the age of 15 to the age of 25, I don't think we really need to go month by month, as if this is some kind of intellectual journey to a goal, which it wasn't. And it's not really until Engels decides to go and live in Brussels that a goal appears. His major goal was, trying to keep his family off his back while keeping money in his pocket, and doing as much politics in and around everywhere as he possibly could, and also incidentally having rather a good time. So it's very much that young man's view, and I think there are interesting things to learn about Marx and his milieu by developing that kind of contrast. So the three themes that I picked up were imagination, observation, and vocation. So that's the story of that little book, which I hope is fun to read, and as we say here, something completely different. So I'll hand back to Kaan, if I may, for a few words about Kohei's excellent and Deutsche Prize winning book.
Okay. I thought the book we want to discuss was the edition.
Oh, the edition. I thought it was Ecological Socialism. I thought that was the one that was the book cover, wasn't it? But go ahead on there. This is the edited collection?
Yes, because this session was thought to be devoted to Palgrave books.
Oh, okay, fine. Mm-hmm.
On Angus.
Go for it.
Right. Well, okay. So a couple of things on this edition by Kohei. This book came out already, I think, last month. We have pretty diverse list of authors from Germany, Japan, Korea, and the US, I believe, or Canada, and Britain. There are about 4 sections in this book, divided according to different topics. The one is Engels and Claus, focusing on young Engels. So we have the Regina Rolf as the first author, who is also a mega editor. He wrote extensively on Engels, the editor of Marx Capital, but here we have her occupation with young Engels on the condition of the working class in England. in the context of its time between 1845 and until 1892. And then Theory of Class Struggle in the Peasant War in Germany by Ryuji Sasaki. Now we have this philosophy section that I share with Tom Roquemore. Roquemore is indeed a well-known figure who now also writes on the Chinese Marxism, I believe, but before he wrote a lot on Georg Lukács, idealism, continental philosophy. In the third section, we have Engels and Crisis as the heading by Tim Grossman. This is the fellow who co-edited with Kohei the Marx Ecological Notebooks in Mega 2. The title is Engels' Theory of Economic Crisis, and then Kohei himself wrote a chapter, Metabolism, Crisis, and Elasticity. Next, we have the South Korean fellow, Seong-Jin Jeong, Engels' concept of alternatives to capitalism. This is also the research project they have in Jinju in South Korea, the alternatives to capitalism or post-capitalism, I believe, is the research project they have. So Seong-Jin tries to bring Engels and that undertaking, that goal, together. And Engels at the margins. In the final section, we have Camilla Royal, who I believe published a short book on Engels last year. Engels as an ecologist is her title. Next, we have Heather Brown, the famous scholar who also wrote on feminism, Marxism. Next, a Japanese fellow, Soichiro Sumida, Engels and the Irish Question, Rethinking and the Relationship Between Peasants and Socialism. And finally, by Thomas Patterson, Engels' Legacy to Anthropology. And that is the debate that clusters around late Engels and Engels' occupation with ethnology, anthropology, and so on. So, the first book that comes to my mind that commemorates Engels' death, I believe, was this book from 1990s, edited by Chris Arthur. It is this yellow book that is pretty well known. I believe Sean Sayers also wrote a chapter for that book. So it is like something like a follow-up volume we have in Kohei's edition.
Okay. I wrote an afterwards to this excellent collection, and I can review that just a little bit if I get it up on the screen. As Kaan says, this is very much the Wuppertal conference, and it was great to be in Engels' hometown at the Bergische Universität Wuppertal. So I've come into this at the end of the collection just meditating on what Engels actually is for us. And that's a rather strange question. We like to talk about, who is Friedrich Engels? That makes sense. But what is Engels throws the focus on how we know and understand him. And so we do that through the collection of texts that comes across as the canon, which itself has a hierarchy. You've seen from the Engels before Marx book that I think it's worthwhile and productive questioning the hierarchy, and indeed questioning what is and is not in the canon. We've seen Kaan's work, which does tremendous textual scholarship just on what the manuscripts are, and not just how they are put together editorially to further certain political and ideological projects, but how different they were in the particular contexts in terms of what Engels was thinking about and trying to do at the particular times that he wrote them, and how putting them together into a volume which looks like a book with a name, even very sort of carefully introduced, sort of elides a lot of distinctions which lead to very seriously skewed readings of the text. So I think it's important to understand that our view of Engels, when we use that word as the subject of a sentence, is already very constructed by a long history of reception. And in the case of Engels, very much by a reception that he constructed himself about himself. So I don't know that he's at all unique in trying to control his reception and his further biographers, but he was certainly very successful at doing that, and we need to keep that on board so that we're not totally gripped by it, and so that we can actually look for other materials that are relevant and see how they work. So I'll just mention that I think it is actually very worthwhile visiting the birthplace. It's kind of a cliche of literalism now, having a sort of favorite author and going back to see where they were born. The house where he and his the infant Engels and his parents lived took a direct hit in World War II, so there's only an empty space there, but the grandfather's house is there, and a couple of other family houses, and indeed, as I said, this was in a factory zone, so you can get something of the experience, I mean, minus all the sights and smells of how closely imbricated he was with the early industrialization and working experiences of the time. I've had a chance to look at a volume which puts together the early industrialization of the area visually. And that, of course, incorporates quite a lot of materials from before, during, and after Engels' lifetime. He was only really resident there for about 25 years, that is, birth to turning 25, and visited only occasionally after that. But it does give you a view of early industry in prints, in engineering diagrams, and you begin to see how and why he was so fascinated with technology and machinery, and how much he brought to Marx by being as interested in all those processes as he was, and he actually grew up with that. That was really nothing like Marx's experience. Engels often gets a lot of credit for being an expert on this or that or the other, but his interest in engineering, industrial technology, as well as working conditions, I think all comes out of his hometown and the kind of people he was in touch with there. So I'll close with that, and we've stuck within the Palgrave series. There, I still like advertising Coho's Deutsche Prize winning book because I think it's excellent. So I'll hand back to Michael at this point. Thanks very much.
To effectively clap, one must unmute.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
I very appreciate both of your presentations. To get to the Q&A, I just want everyone to know, write the word stack in chat, and I will get to you in sequence of your comments, discussions, so questions, excuse me. Who would like to get this started? There's so much to cover. We have about 40 to 50 minutes, depending on how much energy Kaan has, being awake now at 6 a.m. But let's get started with Mr. Alex Steinberg.
Hi, everybody. I'm fascinated by this discussion. I had just completed a class in Engels and the Dialectics of Nature, and the emphasis on that class was not so much the textual understanding of Engels, but the philosophical and scientific implications of a dialectics of nature. And I try to do something that's not been done very much, and that's explore the implications of the idea of a dialectics of nature to the science of cosmology. I also went through, of course, some of the better known interpreters in the natural sciences, the dialectical biologists, Lewontin, Levins, those folks. But that's sort of well known. I think the ideas in cosmology are very new, although Engels, of course, speculated on the dialectics of the universe as well. Of course, the universe as it was known in the latter part of the 19th century was much smaller universe than the one we know about today. But I think the ideas are still fruitful. And I have to say, Terrell, I know your earlier book. I don't know this. I haven't seen this more recent one. And I did very recently come across Kaan's book, which I think is really, it's top of the line. It's really good scholarship. He goes into some of the philosophical issues very clearly, and he does an excellent job in trying to disentangle the philosophical issues from the ideological way in which they have been skewed over the decades. So I certainly recommend that.
Alex, do you have a question, or are you?
Well, my question, I don't really have a question, but if you want to speculate, have either of you thought much about the application of dialectics to the science of cosmology?
Philosophy.
There you go.
That's a question for Kaan.
Okay, so when you speak of cosmology, I will think of Ewald Ilyenkov rather than Engels in the first place. But if you are referring to the cosmos in the physical sense, then the first thing that comes to my mind is the planetary motion, and there's a discussion in Engels' book and in Marx. And that's the fun thing where you find a common reference, a rare common reference, both in Marx and Engels with regards to dialectics of nature. And there's indeed that debate that also is linked to this old question whether dialectics applies to nature or not. So in Marx Cabal, there's this reference to the planetary motion and elliptical motion of the planets revolving around the sun, and Marx speaks of this contradiction that is involved in the elliptical motion. So, and if I remember correctly, it was a manuscript from either from 1874 or 1878 in Dialectics of Nature, where Engels takes up the same issue, although there are some slight differences between the coinage of the terms opposition in Marx and Engels. There's that tackling of the issue of of this particular cosmological question. Now, not everything is really fresh in my mind in that regard, but Marx and Engels were superficially informed by the contemporary debates on this apocalyptic end of our galaxy. And there's this old theory that due to the gravitational pull of the sun, the planets circulating around the sun tend to hit the sun, and that is going to be the end of our universe. So there's that old theory, and Engels keeps changing his mind. That can be followed up in his exchange with Marx, but they are more interested in the theological extrapolations of that old theory. The old theory, I believe there are still followers of that issue. But I mean, this is quite exemplary with regards to the character of Engels' Dialectics of Nature, because there is this and that. He's writing one passage on this issue, and then on the next page he jumps on. In the next manuscript, he jumps to a completely different one. The only thing that I found worth taking up within the formal limits of my book was this issue of the elliptical motion. What Marx says with regards to dialectics and elliptical motion is this in capital. And the passage goes like this, I believe. And this is, now I'm converting the German text into English on my head, but he's saying something like this: it is a contradiction if one body, meaning in orbit, falls into the sun and flies away from it at the same time. And he refers to these opposite or non-identical tendencies of motion of an orbit that clusters around the sun. And Engels says something similar, but not exactly the identical thing in Dialectics of Nature. And this is one of the things I try to make clear in those sections. I believe it was in my chapter 5 in one subsection there.
Can I follow up, Michael? You're muted.
Quick follow-up. Sure, Alex, go ahead.
Okay. What I was thinking of specifically was Engels' discussion of the nebular hypothesis of the origin of the solar system, which he attributes to Kant and Laplace, which, as far as I know, historically was the first kind of scientific theory that speculated on the origin of our solar system. And that the point there being that that nature has a history. So natural science becomes historical science. And I think the further implication of that is that at some point you cannot posit eternal laws of nature if you're going to be a dialectician. That if the universe evolves and everything in the universe evolves, the laws of nature must somehow evolve as well. And that's a speculative theory that's only been investigated in the 20th century, beginning with people like Paul Dirac, but continuing today. And it was championed, by the way, by the fellow who did some of the footnotes to the Dialectics of Nature, the English biologist.
Haldane.
Yeah, he speculated about that as well. Engels, of course, it was not something Engels ever considered, as far as I know.
If you are referring to the historicity of nature with regards to the history of cosmos, there is some speculation in that regard, and Engels emphasizes the historicity not only of nature but also the historicity of laws of our solar system as they came into being, and he tries to break down this old conception, the supposed unchanging conception of the laws, and he tries to, in one passage or so, in one or two passages, he makes that point of the historicity of the laws. This is the one thing that I would like to say in that regard. The second thing is, Marx and Engels lived in an age where they witnessed that someone who is now famous, and also at that time, brought up this issue and tried to prove that nature has a history. So that fellow was Charles Darwin, and the field was biology, of course. But Marx and Engels, as two fellows and politicians, theoreticians, witnessed that this argument was made. And this is pretty new. Now, it is rather self-evident for us, but not for that age. And you have to keep in mind the Hegelian background of Marx and Engels, whereby Hegelian encyclopedia denies evolution as it was understood by the 1850s, 1860s. He's not saying that there is no change or transformation in nature, but that nature has a history is completely wrong in Hegel's conception. So that there's then also a minor debate in Hegel research claiming, well, maybe this is not a rejection in principle, but Hegel did not live long enough to consider a Darwinian way of understanding the history of nature. But in principle, there is a problem in Hegel, because Hegel understands nature as a manifestation of his so-called idea, according to which only idea or this spirit has a history, because of which there is a transformation in nature. So there is this philosophical contextual issue that concerns Hegel, and on the other side, there is a few passages where Engels really speaks of the historicity of laws. But I think there is also a third dimension, a third aspect that points to a certain tension that you have mentioned, namely speaking of eternal laws on one side and defending historicity of nature, because it is the usual charge against Engels that he had made this point concerning the eternal dialectical laws. That is, on one side, you speak of the historicity of nature and identify that with dialectics, but on the other side, you posit these 3 or 4 laws. Indeed, we do not have just 3 laws. In one case, he speaks of 4 laws. And the charge is that he posits them as if they are eternal laws. So I do have one way of looking at that, and there, I do not say eternal, but there are invariants in nature. There are structures in nature that are not subject to change. So, for instance, and this is pretty much on the most abstract level that concerns the ontological structures of nature. And one example I already mentioned. That example is relationship between identity and change, or identity and difference. And anything that is subject to change contains these 2 opposites as their structural components. And if there is change, there is always this interrelation between identity and change. And that's an example of an invariant structure. I'm not saying these are eternal, but they are invariant in that regard. So, that's pretty much that, what I can say about this issue.
Thank you, Kaan. We have 3 people. I want to take Bert and Kevin so that you can address 2 questions, and then we will have Mary. If there is time after Mary, there will be more questions. So Bert, you ask your question, Kevin yours, and then Terrell and Kaan will divide up the answers, I guess. So go ahead, Bert.
Okay. Yeah, I was just hoping that Terrell would amplify something that he said, which really struck me, which was that Engels was, he seemed to be saying to me, was constructing his persona or his public place in relationship to Marx. And I found that very interesting because in graduate school, I did a bit of reading of Victorian literature. And it seems to me that this seems to be a convention, I don't know, a literary convention or a cultural convention of the 19th century, was that there was this great man, and it was a man, great theoretician, and then a popularizer who would explain him to the masses. So I'm thinking of Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, Marx and Engels, and also Holmes and Watson is a really good example. So I'm wondering if you think that Engels was placing himself as sort of like a Nigel Bruce to Basil Rathbone. Just sort of, he seems to be, especially after Marx's death, seems to be explaining the great man to the masses to me. And how much of that do you think he was doing? And was it just a cultural artifact? So that's my question.
And Kevin, your question, please.
Yeah, the Terrell Carver, very illuminating remarks, if I can use that Enlightenment term. So on Engels' discussion of the workers, and if we could add to that political economy and the oppression, just to use a very broad term, of the working class, and I guess you're referring to all the way back in 1839, these letters from Wuppertal and so forth. Okay, so here's my question. In this writing, which Marx praises in Capital, is there any trace of anything resembling even the critique of alienation that we find in Marx's 1844 essay on that topic? In other words, issues like alienation from our own species being or essence, the creativity of labor. Is there any evidence of that, or is it mainly about the material and economic oppression and exploitation of the workers? And maybe the short answer is no, but I'm sure you'll answer longer than
that. Okay, I guess they're both questions for me there. The first one is about Engels' a popularizer. So on the one hand, that does seem to underrate his own achievements, whether before Marx or after, and how we evaluate those. But basically, I think it's a pretty open and shut case, and it was really quite deliberate. So we know that the two of them had a very close political partnership, and that is referenced by Marx in letters, and it's very clear from the letters that they made a point of working together and informing each other, and in a sense speaking for each other and representing each other. What I tried to do in the early works on that I did on Marx and Engels was to look at the intellectual relationship, or rather to look at the texts and ideas very closely and carefully, which is really the kind of question you're asking, Kevin, to see if they're really always on exactly the same kind of theoretical intellectual wavelength as each other. So in terms of Engels as a quote popularizer, unquote, this is quite deliberate. It starts in August 1859. I'm not sure exactly what day, but Marx has just published the half-volume contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and he needs it reviewed. So I think the foundational work in answer to your question is Engels' two-part book review of 1859, which confusingly is called Friedrich Engels' Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, because it's a book review. But it's collected up, and it's quite an interesting read, and that's when he does develop a framework of concepts. So in the little book on Engels that I did, it sort of lists 7 concepts that are very familiar to us. And you can find them in Marx, but they come up in Marx in the course of the discussions that he's actually doing. They're not put there as a kind of sort of guiding set of concepts for you to do. So Engels makes a distinction there, which becomes famous later between a historical method and a logical method. And so people have looked at that and find that he's not very convincing in drawing that kind of distinction. So there are all kinds of things going on in that book review, and the story unfolds after that. So Engels, until Marx is dead, is quite careful writing under his own name and saying these are the ideas of Marx, etc., etc., and that carries on right up till the graveside address. After Marx is dead, you get more of a Marx and I sort of story, but it's basically the same kind of story. So Anti-Düring is, in a sense, what comes out of this 1859 book review, and Engels, of course, in correspondence and works, because he wrote introductions to some dozens of published and republished works by Marx, introducing, being the literary executor and official introducer of Marx, giving his own kind of summary in terms that he started developing in 1859. So one can presume at the outset that there isn't a problem and can't be a problem. On the other hand, if you want to go through it in detail from one side or another, then you can see that there certainly could be problems. And of course, there are interchanges in the correspondence, and you can read those in different ways. It's certainly true that Engels reports various kinds of things to Marx, and Marx, in my view, is often very kind of respectful, saying, well, yes, that's very interesting, but I'm going back to doing what I'm doing now. So with the benefit of hindsight and teleology, one can often get very excited where the two seem to coincide on Engels's terms, but it's very seldom looked at the other way round, really, and I've tried to do that with the comments on technology and political economy, and that's really where I turn to Kevin's question. So the short answer is in the outlines of critique of political economy. Engels is really bringing something to Marx that he knows practically nothing about, but knows that he wants to know about it, because already on the newspaper, Marx had come into contact with what he called, quote, material interests, unquote, for, quote, the first time, unquote. And a couple of his articles are really about property systems and how they are being changed and how they are affecting working class life, whether it's on the near medieval farm where you're kicked off the commons and out of the forest, or stuck at the mercy of the market when there's a bad harvest and the wine trade collapses. So I mean, Marx is getting into this, but essentially no one in the German states had much grasp of political economy as it had been developed already for 150 years in France and in England and in Scotland. So Marx is there in Paris and what drops into the box, but an outline of the whole of political economy as it's been absorbed and done and argued over by Smith and Ricardo and Ferguson and others in the Anglophone world. And this is gold dust. Marx didn't read English, and he got busy reading Adam Smith in French after that. But Marx's world was the world of Hegelian philosophical politics, that is, young Hegelians who were liberalizers and radicals, and the only vocabulary they had to do this in, that they could get published in, was, of course, the vocabulary of Hegelianism. And even then, they had a fair amount of trouble with it because the government was busy kicking them out of universities and appointing people like Schelling instead. So this was really gold dust. Engels, had been to Manchester and been to England. Marx had certainly and seen it all for himself. Marx hadn't even been to the Wupper Valley. So he really had no hands-on experience of this, but he knew it was important. And I think he'd picked up conversations of which we have no record in the newspaper office, because those were the people who were interested in liberalizing the medieval economies, such as they were, and the medieval politics of the German states and principalities. So I think the short answer is no, and Engels wouldn't have learned it that way from the political economy that he'd read. So what we're seeing with the alienation, as Marx himself says in 1845-46, manuscripts of 1846, he's only using that terminology because it's the only thing that liberalizes, that is, Hegelians in the German-speaking lands will be able to understand yet. So shortly after that, or about the same time, he sets off for the summer with Engels for their famous holiday, or not holiday, in Chetham's library, to learn the stuff up. And Marx begins to get involved very seriously with political economy from proper French sources, and to keep up with the Anglophone work that had already been received. So thank you for the questions.
So, Mary, it is your turn on Stack. Go ahead. You need to unmute.
Mute.
You're unmuted. Don't touch anything.
I got this big screen with me. I don't know what I did. How do I get back? View. I hit view. I want.
Mary, you are okay. You can ask your question.
Oh, here I go. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to get unmute. Now now I got confused. Well, first of all, thank you for these wonderful discussions that are going on. I wanted to especially appreciate. Oh, by the way, on this last discussion, in one of Marx's introductions to, I can't remember which one, he talks about himself, about how he was a young lawyer and peasants were being taken to court as thieves, and they didn't know why, because they were just doing what they did traditionally, using the common lands with usufruct rights. And Marx says, I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't understand it at all. And I knew something very fundamental was taking place, but I didn't understand it. So he actually owns up to his reality. I really appreciate that this discussion. It makes them human and makes them people that had to learn and acquire their understanding of the world. And they were at that moment historically where they could do that. That was in the works, as you were discussing earlier in the presentations. And I also want to say I really appreciate the emphasis on the ethnography. I mean, on the what Engels did in ways that Marx never dreamt of doing, and especially the conditions of the working class. It should be acknowledged by humanity. It's the first ethnographic work that was ever done, and nobody's ever recognized that work as such. And it's a fantastic piece of writing. He also did the one they were asked to do the manifesto, the Working Men's Association. I can't remember which one asked them to do the manifesto for them. Engels was the one who made a questionnaire and went around to the workers to gather their asking a whole series of questions that became the basis for the draft of the first manifesto, which he did, and then that was reworked by Marx. he had that orientation that was really fundamental. And Marx couldn't have written The Machinery in Modern Industry without Engels. I mean, he's the one who corrected all the way through, and things in the third volume, he had to correct him about how the thing actually worked. So he was in that sense, they were very definite colleagues, but with all of the kinds of contradictions that you're raising, which I really like. And I just appreciate so much that this attention is being looked at in the ways that you two are and your third comrade are doing. On the question of law and history and dealing with the natural world and physics in particular, sometimes I think we can, I don't know, I want to explore this with you. It's a difficult question, the dialectics of nature and the question of law and historical development and change. But at another level, I think maybe we complicate it. I mean, reality, existence, it is. We can only know it through understanding, developing, I mean, Marx even talks about this, the concepts to understand it. So there's no law in nature, but for us to understand the processes in nature, we construct the concepts and the laws and the character of that. We observe and we look at the reality of that that we're looking at. I mean, a beautiful piece by Richard Lewontin, The Triple Helix, where he's dealing with biology and species in an ecology. And in looking at that, you develop those things. So what are the tools of analysis that we need? I mean, there wouldn't be whatever the Big Bang or whatever it was, all these dust is in the air. But we know that there's the law of gravity, the law of attraction and repulsion. Otherwise, you couldn't have a molecule be formed. You know, these things repelled each other, or they attracted. What formed, I learned from scientists, I learned from Richard Levins, that the coming together that formed what we call atoms and stuff was that the attraction was not so great and the repulsion was not so great, so that they could combine. But that meant they could also separate. And in separating, they could recombine. So you eventually get RNA, DNA, and all these things floating around out there that eventually, or inorganic matter turns into organic matter. So this, to me, the question is reality itself, existence itself, and I'm trying to understand that and what tools of using our brain and make that possible. I don't think we can, nature doesn't have law. We create through our process of understanding the law, and we see those characters. And we see the process, what we're coming to terms with today. To me, the question is, the process is that this is a process of continual change, continual development, of coming into being and going out of being. So then it gets more complicated. But we can also overthink it without really then understanding just the materiality of existence and of being in existence. I don't know, maybe I'm overplaying it in some way. But I thought Marx is taking on that question, and I'm not sure where, a contribution to the critique, where he takes on the question of how do we understand ourselves through concepts, and why this is, and the question of lawfulness is based within that too. So I'm not sure. I'm just throwing this out in a way, and I think we need. It's an important thing for us to be discussing in some way. My gut tells me. So I just want to leave it at that and see if any of this has meaning to you, because I really appreciate the way that you're focusing on these questions. And trying to go deeper into it in a practical and historical and also very individuals thinking about what they're thinking. I guess that's all. Yeah. No comment. Or does it make no sense?
Well, maybe I can say a couple of things about what you said concerning laws.
Yeah.
First of all, in English understanding, there are laws, and nature has laws, and these laws are objective. objective suggests that they are there regardless of whether you acknowledge them or not. It is something like, you can understand in this way, the gravitational pull of Earth. You do not realize when you sit at your chair that there's gravitation. And that doesn't change the fact that your body is pulled towards the center of the Earth. So it is an example of this objectivity and objective effects. Whether this can be called a law is a further question. Now, in the 19th century, it was pretty self-evident that society as well as nature had laws. So the discussion in 20th century shifted from this self-evidence towards the questionability as to whether we should speak of laws or regularities. So in the philosophy of science, there are different definitions of laws, and depending on how you define that law, you can come up with a different conception of nature. That is, whether it makes sense to speak of laws in nature and whether it makes sense to speak of dialectical laws in nature. So there is a problem with regards to Engels' dialectics and how he conceptualizes these dialectical laws. On the one side, he does not have a distinct definition of what a law is, because, well, this is binding for understanding dialectics of nature and his entire undertaking, because he speaks of dialectical laws, but what we rather need is what makes it this a law, and how you distinguish that dialectical law from other ordinary laws that you may find in nature, and whether you can make a distinction between the natural laws or their low character in nature and those so-called laws in society. So one standard definition in the past was, until 19th century, 20th century, was a statistical frequency, or anything that exhibits a statistical frequency and regularity can be called a law. Engels seems to have no problem with this kind of definition as far as my construction is concerned, but probably he would say a law is this under the same circumstances, with the same agents and same interrelations, you can generate the same situation and outcome. So that would be a law. So a law would dictate something like an invariant, or something like an invariance. But now, on one side, we have this stability in terms of Engels' terminology in general in Dialectics of Nature. On the other side, all these discussions really, they developed further after Engels was occupied with this question. So, this is indeed one question that needs further investigation, not only from our perspective, but also from the perspective of Engels' research. And well, this is indeed a problem. And in my book, I try to make the problem character of this problem clear.
Okay, so could I ask you? Your book, you really take on this question. I haven't gotten a chance to read it yet or get a hold of it yet. Are there other people engaging in this discussion that are, I mean, I'd like it to be the scientist. I mean, I am not a natural scientist, but I prefer reading primary readings and not secondary discussions, and work through it. So besides the work that you're talking about, are there other suggestions of things to read to get into this problematic of dialectics and lawfulness and what's being discussed now in the sciences too, in terms of
well, there are the East German and Soviet debates on the law character of Engels' dialectical laws. I don't know whether you read German or Russian. In the Anglophone world, the debate is rather separate. That is, there is the analytical philosophy of science. The most prominent name that comes to my mind is Thomas Nagel, who says nothing about Engels, and then there is the separate literature on Engels' Dialectics of Nature that does not deal with this question concerning the low character of law. So you have to make the connection on your own, I think, if you do not read German or Russian.
I've got a kind of closing remark. I think, Mary, you mentioned the Communist Manifesto, and Engels's work leading up to that. So I have a closing and rather transgressive idea. If you look at the Communist Manifesto parts 1 and 2, they are much, much more like Engels's journalism, and he published about 50 articles more up to that time in English and German. They're much more like his articles in terms of style and content and the emphasis on technology and the broad sweep of history and culture. And of course, the detailed kind of sociological comments on the proletariat. And if you look at what Marx had written up to that point, there is absolutely nothing that resembles it at all. So,
yeah, I agree.
Part 3 of the Communist Manifesto is pure Marx. It's ad hominem, sarcastic critique of those who pretend to be socialists and communists and haven't got it right, and they're clearly located in the class framework, and you know exactly what you're supposed to think at every stage of the game. So part 3 is pure Marx. Parts 1 and 2 just look so much like Engels to me. I wonder if there's a missing draft that we don't have, because one thing about the archive, of course, is it doesn't contain everything, even before the scholars and textual editors get into the hierarchies of importance that they create. So an archive is selective to what has been preserved. So what have we got of the manuscript of the Communist Manifesto? We have one page, exactly. It's on the wall in a glass case behind closed doors at the archive, or at least it was in Amsterdam. At least it was the last time I saw it. And whose handwriting is it in? You could take a wild guess and you might get it right, but the correct answer is Mrs. Marx's handwriting. Because she and a few select others, did the fair copy, which had to be done in order to get something printed, because nobody could read Marx's scribbly handwriting. So there is an issue about that, but that's the only thing that we've got. So I'm just speculating that maybe there's a sort of whole missing thing that we don't have, where we could really see Engels in all his glory. But anyway, I'd leave you with that thought.
Oh, thank you. That is, I love it.